Remember this?
I've covered you for a long time. I've gone to your rallies. I've talked to your people. They love you. They listen to you. They listen to every word you say. They hang on your every word. They don't listen to me or the media or Fauci. They think we're fake news. They want to get their advice from you. And so when they hear you say everything's under control, don't worry about wearing masks, I mean, these are people, many of them are older people,
What's
Mr.
your
President.
definition of control? Yeah, under the
It's giving them a false sense of
right
security.
now, I think it's under control. I'll tell you what.
How? 1,000 Americans are dying a day.
They are dying. That's true. And it is what it is.
Almost 200,000 Americans had already died by the time this interview aired, and they did so as the direct result of Donald's willful and malicious inaction. But for him, we would not have become so divided. But for him, a simple life-saving maneuver like wearing a mask would not have become politicized. But for him, we would not have suffered a mass casualty event in this country every day, month after month after month. So why, when Donald said, "It is what it is," did that send a chill down my spine? Well, for normal people, that phrase means something like, "Things are terrible. Sadly, there's nothing I can do about it. So it is what it is. We just have to accept it and move on." In my family, that is not at all what it meant. What that phrase meant was, yeah, you're going through a bad time. I could help you, but I don't give a shit. So it was the day of my dad's funeral. I was 16. He had died at the age of 42. I didn't know he was sick, so it was a bit of a shock. Anyway, most of us were hanging out in what we called the breakfast room, which was where the family had most of its meals. And I think we were getting ready to go to the crematorium chapel, because I knew that my dad, I don't know why, but I had known for a long time that my dad wanted to be cremated. And I was listening to the adults' conversations. I wasn't talking to anybody, I was just listening. And I heard them talking about the plan, which was to take my dad's ashes and bury them in the family plot in the cemetery. And this horrified me, because not only did I know that my dad wanted to be cremated, I knew he wanted to be cremated because he didn't want to be buried, and he wanted his ashes spread out in the Atlantic Ocean off of Montauk. I wasn't quite ready to talk to my grandfather about that because he was a slightly intimidating, scary man. So, and you know, I had no relationship really with my aunts. So I had seen that Donald had gone into the room we called the library that had no books in it in order to make a phone call. So I went to find him, and he had picked up the phone and he was ready to dial it. And I said, "Hey, listen, I just have a quick question for you. I heard what Grandpa's planning, and I know for a fact that that's not what Dad wanted. And I was wondering if you could please say something to Grandpa so he changes his mind." And Donald said to me, he shrugged first, and then he said, "It is what it is, honey bunch." And then he proceeded to make his phone call. I confronted my grandfather about it the next day, later that day after the service. It did not go well. Years and years later, I was in at my Aunt Marianne's apartment on the Upper East Side, and she started talking about the lawsuit that I had brought against my grandfather's estate because she just couldn't let it go. She had, tried to mend fences with me, but every once in a while, she would just sort of stick the knife in. And she referred to it as the debacle, and made it very clear that she thought it was all my fault, because how dare I get disinherited and then have a problem with it. So in discussing the aftermath, and it was not a great time for me, she literally just said, "It is what it is," as if I should just get over it. And I have. But it wasn't the kindest thing for her to say. Anyway, moving on. I've talked about Donald's cruelty before because unfortunately it has for 10 years been operative in our governance. In an article for The Atlantic during the first Trump administration, Adam Sewer wrote that for Donald, the cruelty is the point. For my grandfather, Fred, that was entirely true. One of the few pleasures my grandfather had, aside from making money, was humiliating other people, especially those weaker and more dependent than he was. Unlike my grandfather, Donald has always struggled for legitimacy. Now, as the occupant of the Oval Office, who can never escape the taint of being utterly without qualification, or the sense that his win in 2016 was illegitimate, which he will never get over. Over Donald's lifetime, as his failures mounted, despite my grandfather's repeated and extravagant interventions, his struggles for legitimacy, which could never be won, turned into a scheme to make sure that nobody found out that he's never been legitimate at all. This has never been more true, of course, than it is now, and it is exactly the conundrum our country finds itself in. The government, as it is currently constituted, including the executive branch, all of Congress, and the corrupt, illegitimate supermajority of the Supreme Court, is entirely in the service of protecting Donald's ego. That has become almost its entire purpose, and now we throw Elon Musk into the mix. Donald's cruelty serves in part as a means to distract both us and himself from the true extent of his failures, and the more egregious his failures become, the more egregious his cruelty becomes. His cruelty is also an exercise of power, such as it is. He's always wielded it against people who are weaker than he is, or who are constrained by their sense of duty, or their dependence from fighting back. Employees and political appointees can't fight back when he attacks them on his failing social media company, because to do so would risk their jobs or their reputations. World leaders are constrained from calling out Donald's incompetence and threats for fear he'll withhold aid or double down on his reckless unilateral decisions to harm Western liberal democracy and the world order. Donald learned a long time ago how to pick his targets, and he has only gotten better at it. And now there are more of them. But the cruelty is also a symptom of Donald's near sociopathic indifference to human suffering and his impulse to make others suffer. He continues to exist in the dark space between the fear of indifference, that is, the fear of people being indifferent to him, and the fear of failure, knowing as he does on an unconscious level that he is a failure. The role that fear played in Donald's childhood cannot be overstated, and it plays a much greater role now. We see this. We see this every day. But again, why? Well, quite simply, Donald today is very much the same as he was at 3, incapable of growing, unable to regulate his emotions, or moderate his responses, or take in and synthesize information. Although it's much worse now, actually. His need for affirmation is so great that he doesn't seem to notice that the largest group of his supporters are people he would not condescend to be seen with outside of a rally. His deep-seated insecurities have created in him a black hole of need that constantly requires the light of compliments, that disappears as soon as he's soaked it in, and then he needs more. Nothing is ever enough. This is far beyond garden variety narcissism. It's because he's not simply weak. His ego is a very fragile thing that must be bolstered in every single moment, because he knows deep down that he is nothing of what he claims to be. He also knows he's never been loved. So he has to draw you in if he can. Then he can make his vulnerabilities and insecurities your responsibility. You must assuage them. You must take care of him, because failing to do that leaves a vacuum that is unbearable for him. If you're somebody who cares about his approval, you will say anything to retain it. He has, after all, suffered mightily, and if you aren't doing everything you can to alleviate that suffering, you should suffer too. Donald was my grandfather's monster. He was actually the only child of his that mattered, but He was ultimately rendered unlovable by the very nature of Fred's preference for him. In the end, there was no love for Donald at all, just his agony for it. This left him enraged, and the rage, because he was never loved and would never be loved, continued to grow. We must never forget that this rage is unstoppable, because the more Donald has, the more he realizes that the void will never be filled, and the more greedy and vengeful he becomes. And if he can in any way profit from your death, he will facilitate it. And then he will ignore the fact that you died.